Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you, and welcome to what I hope will be an informative and frank discussion about funds, funding, and financing for humanitarian action. My name is Christina Bennett. I'm the Chief Executive of the START Network, an NGO membership of 55 local, national, and international organizations, and I'll be moderating the session today. The session is called Shocks to the System: Humanitarian Financing, Sustainability, and Transparency When New Needs Arise. And I'm sure that nobody listening to this webinar, nobody in the room doubts the importance of the emphasis that we're playing on this session. Namely, how do we improve not just the levels of funding, but the quality of the sources and the uses of that funding in the face of new risks, whether from conflict, from climate, from economic downturn, or importantly, the combination of all three. So today, first, we're going to talk about needs, risks, and vulnerabilities. And OCHA will give us an update of the global humanitarian overview at mid-year and where we stand in meeting the financial targets of our $40 billion appeal, launched even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impacts it's had, which include 15 million people besieged inside the country, 7 million people displaced outside of the country, and close to 50 million people in 43 countries around the world at risk of famine. We're then next going to hear from development initiatives ahead of the publication of their annual Global Humanitarian Assistance Report. DI will hopefully give us the reality check on the state of humanitarian financing, but also hopefully highlight the importance of alternative forms of financing through anticipation and prepositioned funds and direct channels to local organizations to make the funds go further in protecting more people. We need only to look at the compelling stories of human solidarity in places like Ukraine, in Tonga, in Bangladesh, to understand that these more devolved, place-based ways of working must be the future of how we do aid. Then we're going to have an excellent panel of experts from government, civil society, and international NGOs about how these global trends look and feel from their perspective and from the perspectives of their organizations and their own experiences. And then we're going to bring all of you into the discussion through a poll, which will take the temperature of the room, so to speak, on what you feel are the most pressing humanitarian financing priorities. Also, just to note that next week, the G7 summit is meeting on some of these issues, and it's an excellent opportunity for us to call upon these governments to demonstrate global leadership, solidarity, and responsibility by addressing what is staggering levels of need in multi-layered crises around the world. So let's collectively send the right message to them through this discussion. So before we get started, some sort of housekeeping details for all of you to take note of. First, the audience should, I welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat box and to share any comments you have about the presentations. But if you have a question, I invite you to pose that question using the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen so that we can keep track of the questions that come in. If there's a question that an audience member really wants to get answered that they've asked and there's not time for an answer, there will be colleagues monitoring the Q&A so that we can follow up afterwards directly with you on an answer to that question. But please leave us your email details so that we can contact you afterwards. This event is also being recorded and will be made available on Development Initiative's website following the event. So please also let others know who may have missed it. And we're also going to be using closed captioning, subtitles. So just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles for the captions to appear on your screen. We'll post those instructions in the chat now. And following the event, there will be an opportunity for you to feedback through a Zoom survey, which we would like you and encourage you to fill in because it only makes us better at what we do. So let's get started with some of the conversations. First, I'd like to introduce Anya Nietzsche, Chief of Partnerships and Resource Mobilization from OCHA, who will deliver the first presentation on the Global Humanitarian Overview at mid-year. Anya, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Christina. And also colleagues, excellencies, guests here today with us. We're very much looking forward to having a really interesting discussion and engaged discussion, given that humanitarian financing is, of course, one of the very important issues that we have on our minds, and we need to have on our minds. As Christina already said, last December, we launched a 2022 Global Humanitarian Overview, the largest ever, requiring 41 billion to meet the needs of people around the world. Acute hunger and risk of famine were already a reality for millions in December last year, so displacement was at record levels. Conflicts, wage terror, and the climate crisis had already gathered significant strengths. So never have so many complex emergencies come together. But as all of us know, much has happened since. The war in Ukraine has triggered a colossal protection crisis and leading to Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. The fallout of the war has heightened a pre-existing global food crisis by pushing up the price of food and fuel and disrupting supplies, and of course also having much further ripple-on effects that we all fear and already experience today. The next slide, please. So a record number of people are, at this point in time, acutely food insecure, and 750,000 are just one step away from famine. I personally recently returned from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is a country with the highest number of internally displaced people in Africa, and where 1 in 4 Congolese does not know when they will eat next. I spoke to survivors of gender-based violence and was struck by their heartbreaking testimonies, but also by their courage. All of this was a very stark reminder that we need to double down on prevention and support and end impunity of perpetrators, particularly in this area. But overall, of course, we need to do much more. These are the types of challenges that the GHO has set out to ease. Next slide, please. I now would like to update you on the 2022 Global Humanitarian Overview, which currently requires $46.3 billion to assist more than 200 million people in need in 69 countries. That is a threefold increase in people in need compared to 2015. Humanitarian requirements and the number of people who need aid have increased in all regions of the world, as you can see here, with the most significant increases in Eastern Europe because of Ukraine, obviously, and in Asia and the Pacific because of Afghanistan. Our mid-year figures paint a complicated picture. They reflect donors' great generosity, with a record high of more than 9.5 billion received thus far, so still relatively early in the year. But at the same time, the numbers have triggered tremendous concern about the current gap of $36 billion and how this year's aid envelopes will not be able to fill that gap. The 36 billion gap is almost 10 billion more than the 27 billion we needed for the entire GHO in 2019. So really a massive gap that we are facing. On average, the response plans are merely 20% funded. And what is particularly worrying is that 28 plans are well below average, including such crises like Myanmar, Mali, Niger, and the Syria regional response, to name a few. Let me say a few words about the cost of inaction, because humanitarian action has saved and protected millions of lives in 2022. Funding has allowed the humanitarian system to scale up the provision of food and cash, health, clean water, protection services, and emergency education wherever possible, reaching tens of millions with assistance this year already. However, when funding doesn't arrive on time, or when appeals are underfunded, and I've already given you the numbers for many of the major crises in the world these days, then that leads to food aid being cut, health clinics shuttered, and the number of people we can target with life-saving aid shrinks. Haiti, for example, Haiti has one of the highest levels of food insecurity in the world, with almost 1 in 2 people needing food assistance and more than 1 in 2 living below the poverty line. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine has led to higher wheat prices and transport costs also in this country, and inflation is expected to reach 30% by the end of the year. In a country where the average household spends half of its income on food, insufficient aid that we can provide will certainly have a devastating impact on people's lives and well-being. The Horn of Africa. Vulnerable people in the Horn of Africa are already starving, following its worst drought in 40 years, with parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia experiencing 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons. So far, humanitarians have reached about 6.5 million drought-affected people, but as prices soar and the lean season sets in, more funds are urgently required to provide food, nutrition, health, and livelihood support in the months to come. In Sudan, the number of people facing severe hunger is set to double to 18 million by September. Unless we get the funding to step up, we will see catastrophic hunger taking hold. In neighboring South Sudan, severe hunger is gripping over 8 million people, making it one of the world's worst hunger crises. Yet, as the cost of food assistance has risen, WFP is having to reduce the number of people it reaches from 6 million to 4.5 million. I could give you many more examples: Syria, Sri Lanka, the Sahel, and so on. So I believe that everyone can agree that at a time of global mega crises all across the globe, 20% funding, which I've just presented to you as an average of our HIP funding, is nowhere near enough. A quick word on our pooled funds. They continue to play a critical role in humanitarian response. In 2022, SURF and the country-based pooled funds have allocated $971 million, a record, for life-saving assistance. SURF has responded to the growing food insecurity crisis with an allocation of 100 million already back in April to 7 hunger hotspots in Africa and the Middle East. These areas are affected by drought and the spillover effects of the conflict in Ukraine, already described. This was followed by a special allocation in May of 30 million to 4 countries in the Sahel. Nevertheless, still not enough. SURF also has made its largest ever underfunded allocation this year, 150 million. This funding is a lifeline for underfunded crises and sectors. Country teams were encouraged to involve local partners at all stages of the process, from developing a strategy to implementation, so also move really strongly on the localization agenda. Our country-based pooled funds have also carried out a wide range of activities and continue to be one of the biggest providers of direct support to local and national NGOs. For example, the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund has expanded its pool of partners and quickly scaled up activities. The Regional Humanitarian Fund for West and Central Africa completed its second allocation of $20 million in Burkina Faso, which went mainly to local and national NGO. And also the Ethiopia and Somalia funds allocated 67 million for the ongoing drought and food crisis. And just to quickly also mention the Afghan largest allocations ever in response to the humanitarian needs triggered by flash floods, landslides, and deteriorating access to food. So we're quite proud of our pooled funds, and of course also advocate for further support and commitment from the world community to make them the tool that they can be and should be, within even larger amount of funding at their disposal. So here I want to have a quick invitation sent out to you. We are inviting you to join the launch of the 2021 Pooled Funds reports next Thursday on the 30th of June. And also please take a look at the reports. They're already online. They're really exciting, an exciting read with lots of detail and interesting examples, what works, but also, of course, further direction in terms of what we need to do next together. Let me share three important takeaways at the end of my presentations. So first, donor generosity is keeping millions of people alive. It's therefore extremely important. And so far, donors have kept their commitments to fund Ukraine while not forgetting other humanitarian crises. We have actually very encouraging data. But there is, of course, a clearly imbalance between the funding of different crises. And it could get worse as the year goes on. So extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. All humanitarian crises deserve sufficient, timely, and flexible funding. Second, the humanitarian community has been alerted and has been alerting of famine risks for many, many months now, but this has not translated yet into sufficient aid. To stand by and let famine take hold would be a stain on our collective conscience. So where hunger and starvation set in, it pushes back progress for communities and societies for years. We know this. And the global hunger crisis requires urgent funding now before it is too late. And finally, we must look forward to the years ahead, in particular also to 2023, and ensure that the feared cuts to development aid and potentially also to humanitarian aid that might come in the next few years, that this does not trigger greater humanitarian needs in the medium term and of course also in the long term. It is important that generous and sustainable development aid is maintained together with increased humanitarian giving at this time of deepening poverty, crumbling basic services, and unequal pandemic recovery. Vulnerable people need to survive crises today, and vulnerable people also need to find a way out of crisis tomorrow, and they need our help in doing this. This requires complex solutions to go beyond humanitarian aid, and the overall aid architecture, I'm sure we're going to discuss also today, must be robust enough to stand up to the challenge. So I really look forward to hearing from the exciting panelists today and also the audience on how we can move together meeting these challenges. Thank you so much. Back to you, Christina.
Thanks very much for that, Anya. And thanks for some of those staggering statistics. I mean, I note that you said there's a $30 billion gap in the appeals right now at mid-year, and that gap is larger than the entire appeal in 2019, despite the generosity of donors thus far. So I think that's something, a really important statistic to remember. And I also note that you said there were some encouraging signs about the sort of Ukraine effect on humanitarian funding. It certainly feels like there's a lot of attention on Ukraine right now. So thank you for reminding us of all the other places that deserve our assistance and support, and where there is also great high levels of suffering. So thanks for all of that. And maybe now I'm going to turn to our next speaker, Angus Urquhart, who is the Crisis and Humanitarian Lead at Development Initiatives. You know, Angus, you've just heard what Anya said about where we are at mid-year with the appeal. Put this into context for us in terms of the overall humanitarian financing trends for 2022. Thanks, go ahead.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Christina, and thank you, Anya, as well for your excellent presentation. If indeed it was slightly sobering, but good that I think there were some seeds of encouragement there in terms of the response that we're seeing for Ukraine at least. So on behalf of DI, welcome everybody to today's discussion. It's great to have you all here, and a special thank you to Christina for chairing, and also to our other panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us today. I hope you can all see my screen, and here we go. Yes. So I'm going to share, as Christina says, some of the key findings from Development Initiative's forthcoming Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which will be coming out in a couple of weeks' time in mid-July. I think, yeah, as you say, Christina, I think my task is to provide a little bit of reflection on what that wider humanitarian financing landscape looks like. So a little bit about how the system responded to the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic last year in 2021, and to provide a bit of a backdrop for our understanding of the challenges that we face in funding humanitarian response effectively in 2022, not least, as we all know, in terms of the fallout from the Ukraine crisis. So what I will do is I'll try to briefly cover a little bit about how much international humanitarian assistance there is and what the trends are we're seeing with that, who's providing this and how, what we see of the wider finance that's reaching countries experiencing crisis, and then finally about how efforts to improve humanitarian financing are progressing. As you noted, Anya, earlier on, we know that humanitarian needs to grow, and it continues to grow and is in fact growing much faster than we've ever seen before, driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, by climate change, by newly emerging conflict. And as we're all very, very well aware at the moment, we see the worsening food security situation in 2022. These are all things that we highlight in our GHA report this year. So to kick us off, so how did funders, both public and private, respond in 2021 to this sustained historically high levels of need? So in 2020, we saw that international humanitarian assistance from governments and from EU institutions, and so you can see in the bottom part of the chart here, and then from private donors in the top part, the lighter blue part of the chart. Essentially, we saw that assistance for the past 3 years had plateaued. We saw very, very little change in the total volume of assistance provided. In 2021, what do we see? We see a marginal increase. So total humanitarian assistance grew by about 0.7 billion US dollars to 31.3 billion, the highest volume we've ever seen, but a marginal increase on the previous year. This increase was primarily due to an increase in the volume of assistance from public donors, which grew by just under $1 billion US dollars. And as we can see for the preliminary figures for private donors, we see similar levels to 2020, just a slight decrease from 6.5 to 6.4 billion US dollars. But essentially, as we look at the chart, what's evident is that we've seen an effective stalling in the growth in international humanitarian assistance. So between 2018 and 2021, growth is just 2.6%. And that compares to the previous years from 2012 to 2017, a growth of more than 10% each year. So if we narrow our focus a little bit to see where some of that humanitarian assistance has been targeted, one of the things that I think Anya already highlighted, but which we were very well aware of during the pandemic, was the widely reported impacts of the pandemic on the reversal of previous gains in gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So new research that we've conducted has for the first time sought to identify where that assistance was being provided that was specifically targeting gender-related needs. And what we found is that the funding specifically targeted to gender, so for programs that have gender as the primary objective, and here you can see those as the bottom two parts of the bar. So we have gender-based violence funding and other funding that's specifically targeting gender needs. We've seen that this has doubled between 2018 and 2021. We know perhaps that some of that increase is due to better reporting and increased attention on gender-related issues, but nonetheless, I think it represents positive growth. However, the volume of finance we're looking at here still represents a small proportion of the total assistance provided. And moreover, despite these evident increases, we know that the volumes that are being provided are falling well short of the equally fast rising needs. So where is our humanitarian assistance being channeled? Who are the recipients of this? In 2021, the majority of international humanitarian assistance went to a relatively small number of crises, as has typically been the case in previous years. So here we're showing the 10 largest recipients of international humanitarian assistance in 2021, and these 10 countries represent about 60% of all country allocable humanitarian assistance. It's also notable that over the course of previous years, 4 or 5 years, we see relatively little change in the makeup of this group of countries, just 1 or 2 countries moving in or out of this 10 largest each year. You can see that Yemen was the largest recipient in 2021, receiving about 2.7 billion US dollars. So that's about 12% of all country allocable funding. Also noticeable the very sharp increase in funding to Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover of the country. So assistance there almost doubling in 2021. What we also know is that most of the largest recipients face protracted and indeed repeated crisis. And indeed, if we widen our view beyond these 10 recipients to look at all of the larger recipients, all of those countries with significant humanitarian needs, we know that those experiencing protracted crisis, or the number experiencing protracted crisis, continues to grow. So 36 countries, we estimate, are experiencing what we would term as protracted crisis. So here, what we're talking about are countries that have 5 or more years of consecutive UN humanitarian appeals. And what's also very noticeable is that these countries with protracted crises account for 86% of all country allocable humanitarian assistance. So humanitarian assistance is there for the long term. Who's providing this assistance? Who are the largest donors? As I mentioned earlier, total funding from public donors increased in 2021. However, we've seen relatively little shift in the makeup of the donor base itself. We know that the 3 largest donors, the US, Germany, and the UK, accounted for about 60% of all of the humanitarian assistance from public donors, a similar trend that we've seen in previous years. What's noticeable here as we look at this chart, which breaks down donor funding by region, is, I think, sort of 3 things. The first is that both the US and Germany, the 2 largest donors in 2021, both increased their assistance by more than 10%. You can see that evident in the second line on the chart there for the US. But also that we saw significant increases in assistance provided by Japan. So Japan's assistance doubled last year. So from up to about 1.2 billion. And again, you can see that in the second bottom line for Far East Asia. What's evidenced in the top line is the fall in the overall assistance collectively from European donors. And what's driving that, despite these increases from Germany, is the second year of very large reductions from the UK. So UK assistance decreased by 39%, a cut of almost $1 billion in 2021. So we know that humanitarian assistance, as Anya also alluded to in her presentation, forms part of wider official development assistance budgets. And I think the wider picture is really important here. With so many countries experiencing protracted crisis, they need not only humanitarian assistance, but also those longer-term development, peace-building and climate-related interventions that can enable them to be resilient to and recover from crisis. And as more countries face humanitarian crisis, more official development assistance is going to those countries experiencing humanitarian crisis. And indeed, the proportion of total ODA or official development assistance provided as humanitarian assistance has grown. So we see in 2012, about 9.4% of total ODA was for humanitarian assistance, and that proportion has grown to 14% in 2021. We also know that donors are facing increasingly difficult choices, so both with pressure on their ODA budgets from other government spending priorities, and indeed pressure on how that ODA budget itself is allocated. This is particularly the case for a number of European donors, as they support Ukraine with humanitarian but also military assistance, and also as they take in refugees fleeing the conflict. Estimates for in-country refugee spending in 2022 suggest that it's likely to reach double, perhaps even triple, the previous peak that we saw in 2016 at the height of the Syria refugee crisis. So estimates suggest that it might rise as high as 30, maybe even 40 billion US dollars. And for comparison, we were spending just over $8 billion in 2021. The choices that donors face also relate to addressing the threat of climate change. What we can see here is that a small amount of official development assistance is allocated to climate adaptation. In 2020, just 4.7% of total, 4.9% of total ODA. But what we also know is that countries experiencing protracted crisis are actually receiving a smaller proportion than this. Just 3% of their total ODA is for climate adaptation. And yet, while critical, having more adaptation funding alone is not going to be sufficient, as it does not address the actual loss and damage caused by natural disaster, costs at present often absorbed into rising humanitarian requirements. So given the importance of addressing the underlying causes and drivers of crisis, like climate change, the role of other development actors in crisis settings is important. In particular, multilateral development banks that can mobilize large volumes of finance. As you can see from the chart here, multilateral development bank funding, multilateral development banks have allocated a higher volume and a greater proportion of their ODA expenditure to countries experiencing humanitarian crisis. So here we're showing the ODA expenditure from multilateral development banks to the 20 largest recipients of humanitarian assistance. And you can see that between 2015 and 2020, ODA expenditure has doubled from multilateral development banks. It's also accounting for a growing share of the total ODA that MDBs disperse. So to countries experiencing humanitarian crisis, it's increased from 27% of their expenditure to 38% by 2020. And as we detail in this year's report, where we look at a number of World Bank crisis financing tools, more of the finance is being provided through specific mechanisms looking at crisis-related issues that are increasingly intersecting with humanitarian response. And while the wider engagement in crisis settings is important, what we also know is that humanitarian financing itself needs to adapt and improve. A second phase of the Grand Bargain process to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of humanitarian funding was launched in 2021. However, as we show in this year's report, progress on priority commitments was, unfortunately, as in previous years, uneven. There were, I think, aspirations for a step change in the localization of humanitarian response through the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, these do not appear to have been realized. As we can see here, when we look at direct funding to local and national actors, what we've actually seen is a reversal of even the meager progress that we've seen in previous years. So following a slight increase in 2020 that you can see in the chart here, what's actually happened is that funding to local national actors reduced by 2/3 in 2021 to the lowest volume and the lowest proportion of total assistance, just 1.2% that we've seen in the previous 5 years. The second of the Grand Bargain's 2 priority commitments, so alongside localization in its second phase, is to achieve a critical mass of quality funding. So I know that Frida, who's on the panel, can speak authoritatively to the progress that's being made in efforts to improve multi-year funding through the caucus that's running within the Grand Bargain. But one of the other central features of the quality funding agenda is the extent of earmarking. However, as with funding to local and national actors, the picture we see is a disappointing one. As you can see from the chart here, the proportion of unearmarked funding, which was received by 9 UN agencies, declined to its lowest level in 6 years, so falling to 13% of total funding received, following a slight increase in 2020. To finish on a more positive note, as we've reported in previous years, our analysis shows that volumes of humanitarian assistance that are provided in the form of cash and vouchers continues to grow. And that was also the case in 2021. So here we're showing preliminary data on global humanitarian cash and voucher assistance. And this shows that the volume transferred to recipients, so here you can see that as the lower bar, the red bar on the chart, increased to $5.3 billion in 2021, an increase of about 4% from the previous year. We know that when the final accounts are complete, this total is likely to be slightly higher and to represent around 21% of total humanitarian assistance being provided as cash and voucher assistance. In the context of escalating need and increasingly constrained funding, the humanitarian system remains under immense strain, perhaps more strain than it's ever been under previously. I'm very much looking forward to hear from our panel about their experiences of operating in these conditions, and in particular to see where they think change is most pressing, but also perhaps where change is also possible in this very, very difficult environment, whether that's to the sources of funding, whether that's to how the funding is delivered and structured, or the engagement and greater participation of non-traditional actors in crisis settings. So, with my final words, I'd like to thank you firstly for listening, but also remind you that our Global Humanitarian Assistance Report will be out shortly, in a couple of weeks' time in mid-July. For those of you who would like to receive an early copy of the report, you can follow the link here on the slide, which will also be posted in the chat. So, with those words, thank you for your attention, and Christina, I'll pass back to you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Angus. Although I have to say it was a kind of depressing picture of those global humanitarian financing trends. I mean, I note things like, only 2% growth, 2.6% growth overall in humanitarian funding. Positive signs on the gender front, but still not enough given the rising needs of GBV. 86% of humanitarian action is spent on protracted crises. I might come back to you on that after we have another question. And that decline in funding to local organizations, and particularly in a year post-COVID or during COVID, when local organizations were so critical to getting funding on the ground. It's just interesting to see that did not translate into more direct funding to them. But I just know that anyone who has a question, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I do have a question for Anya that I'd like to start out with, and then we'll take other questions as they come in. Anya, if you could come on camera. A question from the audience: what are the funding mechanisms for early warning systems for prevention, detection, and timely actions for better humanitarian response? So, what are some of those sort of more anticipatory or early warning and prevention tools that you have in your toolkit?
Thank you so much, Christina, and really also an interesting question, given that, I mean, if you look at the scale of the funding that is needed, of course, the earlier we can make funding available and also pre-position in mechanisms that and supplies, etc., the better we are off in the longer term, right? So a lot of investment has happened in this area in the last few years, including also from OCHA. But I also want to highlight, of course, colleagues from the START network. You're spearheading a lot of the anticipatory action, different mechanisms and tools in the development, also together with a number of other UN agencies like WFP, FAO, but also IFRC. They're leading on developing much more robust frameworks for this. For OCHA itself, we have made this a big priority within our SURF allocations, and indeed in the last 2 years, we have actually spent 5% of SURF allocations on anticipatory action directly, so over $60 million to bring different partners together and also scale up coordinated action. So for instance, we have triggered those frameworks in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh, and jointly reached 2.5 million people through these anticipatory action frameworks. There are additionally, there are a number of frameworks already live, ready to be triggered in Niger, Burkina Faso, Malawi, Nepal, and also the Philippines. And we're also working on the development for other crises in Chad, DRC, and Madagascar. Some of them actually also with the protected crises we have already referred to. We're also trying to bring the SURF and the CBPF together in terms of acting early and also investing in anticipatory action and early systems and related financing, and put this all in place. So for instance, recently we have approved the $19 million from SURF and CBPF in South Sudan, based on risk forecasts to mitigate and avert humanitarian crises. And there's also quite some work happening in the Horn of Africa. Nevertheless, we still have to get better and more targeted. And I think there's also a call to look at how the different tools and mechanism and financing streams we have available, how can we make them actually more anticipatory and faster in the way they respond to the crises, that we can actually reliably forecast. And as we know, at least 20% of the crises and the emergencies that we are seeing, they are actually, we can actually anticipate them early on, and that's why we have to also respond in that manner. So that might also require a shift in the way how we allocate resources across board. But this is more from the OCHA perspective. But indeed, there are other different mechanisms, and maybe Christina, you can also chip in here, given the strong experience of your network.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the shout out, Anya. And I want to move us on, but maybe just to say that, yes, START Network has been working on this anticipatory risk finance agenda for some time. And we launched this year or last year at COP26, a product called Start Ready, which basically pre-positions funds at scale based on pre-agreed plans that are developed at country level to address risks, so we can get money on the ground before a crisis happens and deal with the potential effects of that crisis before anyone has to suffer. So it's a really exciting product that we've got. Yeah, you'll see more of it as the months go by. All right, let's move on, because we've got more to do and more to talk about here. What I'd like to do now is to have you take a poll. You'll now see a question on your screen with multiple choice answers. And I'd like to invite all of the members of the audience to respond to this poll. You've got 1 minute to read the questions, and then we'll be coming back to you later in the session to kind of react to what you've told us. But this is about prioritizing humanitarian financing. What is the most important way in which humanitarian financing needs can change and adapt? So register your vote now for the most important priority for humanitarian financing. I'm going to give everybody a minute to read and vote, and then we will move on. Panelists, you're up next. Okay. I think looks like the responses have slowed down. All right, we'll give you the results in the poll in just a minute. But now what I'd like to do is turn to the exciting panel that we've got of speakers, so that we can hear from some others about the reflections from your own experience as to what Anya and Angus have just talked about. You've just now heard from two people giving you sort of the global context of needs, risks, and vulnerabilities. and also what the humanitarian funding and financing picture looks like. So I wanted to ask you how you can relate your own experience to these global trends. So I'm going to start first with Mrs. Amira Al-Hefeti, who's the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations. Please, Amira, you have the floor. My question to you is, so UAE is a humanitarian donor and you're providing humanitarian assistance to crises around the world. You know, given what you've just seen about where the balance of that funding goes, you know, what drives your choices about where and who to fund? And then maybe as part of your answer, tell us about what changes you might make as the year goes on and as the humanitarian financing landscape becomes clearer and, you know, potentially more dire given the impacts of the Ukraine crisis. Go ahead, Amira. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christina, for moderating this session. And I would like to also thank OCHA and Development Initiatives for this invitation and for organizing this important virtual event. Like most humanitarian donors, the UAE allocates aid based on need and takes into consideration where our bilateral support can fill a gap in the landscape of international assistance. And in order to prioritize and design our programs, we look at data from national governments and affected communities and rely heavily on the analysis of UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations. And I should say that the UN and its partners' disaggregation of data by gender, age, and ability is especially influential, as our experience confirms that women's and youth empowerment will result in earlier and more sustainable recovery. And on this basis, we have made some of the largest humanitarian allocations to UNFPA and UNICEF. Also, one of the UAE's specialty field is logistics. As many of you might know, we host the UN's largest logistics and supply hub at the International Humanitarian City in Dubai. And to give you an indication of its scale and openness, Dubai processed 85% of the PPE in the WHO-led COVID response in the beginning of the pandemic. So we often partner with UN agencies to provide flights and similar support for relief operations. We also encourage private sector engagement in humanitarian relief. DP World, one of the world's largest logistics companies, for instance, signed an unprecedented deal last year with UNICEF to lend its ports, trucks, and planes to COVAX facility. So looking ahead, it's sadly clear that the need for food relief is going to continue to grow in light of the alarming rise of global food insecurity driven or exacerbated by conflicts, climate change, and COVID-19. So I expect that more of our aid and logistics cooperation will focus on getting food to the most vulnerable populations. At the same time, I think there is scope in many humanitarian plans to increase the focus on early recovery and stabilization. And OCHA has been a great champion here, mainstreaming this concept of restoring basic services and economic functioning earlier rather than later in a crisis. So from our experience in places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, this is one of the more sustainable ways to address financing needs.
Wonderful, Amira. Thanks very much for that. I'm just going to move on to now the second panelist, and then maybe we can get a bit of a conversation going before you have to go, Amira. I know you have to go a bit early. So now I'm going to turn to Amal Sayam, the director of the Women's Affairs Center in the occupied Palestinian territory. Amal, you are looking at it from sort of the other side, from a recipient organization. And in the context of what you've heard, increasing need, incredibly constrained financing, and as a women's-led organization and an organization for women's issues, what concrete actions could your organization not do because of this constrained financing environment? What would you, as a women's organization, do differently or better if you had a stronger and more diverse donor base that provided more timely and more flexible funding? And I note that, Angus has reported there is more funds potentially for gender issues. And the UAE has also said they've prioritized it. But I want to know what that looks like from your side. And then what could you do if you had a stronger and more diverse donor base that provided you with that more flexible and higher levels of funding?
Yes, good afternoon. And first, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this very important event, and it's my pleasure to share with you from my long experience as a director of Women Affairs Center in Gaza, Palestine. Before I talk about the answer your question, it's very good to start talking about the status of fund for the women's organization. And in this regard, we can say that we as women organizations play key role, very important role to providing humanitarian action, especially in providing humanitarian services for marginalized women and girls. So in the same time, these women organizations face many challenges in receiving sufficient and continued fund in order to respond to the increasing critical needs for our target group. The reality said that the needs are increasing day by day due to a specific condition in Palestine, especially in Gaza Strip. But in the same time, the interventions are still limited and insufficient because of the lack of funds. Women organizations hope to reach all women, especially the marginalized and vulnerable women, GBV survivors, girls, women with disability, women with cancer, divorced women, widows women, and others who are in need, but sometimes we cannot do this because of the lack of funds. In fact, the majority of the women's organizations do not receive core or continued funds that could enable us to quickly respond and carrying out interventions with more flexibility, which could not be implemented through short-term projects. Also, women organizations receive inconsistent and uncontinued and short-term projects or funds. Also, we depend on a project-based fund that restrict us to achieve what we wanted to achieve. In addition, there is no specific and clear quota and mechanism to provide fund for women organizations in general and core and the flexible fund in particular. Women organizations work in very hard conditions and using their financial and the human resources in writing projects, filling applications, competing with many other organizations to have fund, and at the end, maybe they do not have fund. For example, Women Affairs Center last year, we wrote more than 25 projects and we succeed to have just 7 projects. And when we talk about OCHA, because it is even implemented by OCHA, and OCHA HF, really OCHA HF support women organization and funded number of women organization last period and this year, including Women Affairs Center. But in general, the support is still limited. Otherwise, it is offering a quick financing, enabling these organizations to advancing organizational sustainability in terms of providing services and building the capacity of the organizations and their partner grassroots CBOs. Also HF is strengthening the partnership between the organizations in Gaza and West Bank, as well as also providing life-saving service, including multi-sectorial service that target most vulnerable groups. During the last project funded by OCHA, work achieved around 8,500 women and girls. In addition, also HF contribute in providing services that meet the priority need of the various target group in terms of their age, sex, and disability, and other target groups. Also, positive issue for HF that OBT-HF has short procedure in terms of announcement the allocation until the proposal awarding. To have immediate and quick start up and providing services and targeting people who are at risk. Also, it coordinates with other clusters to avoid duplication and overlapping of services provision, and share information and exchange lesson learned and best practices for unscaling and upscaling and improving future action, as well as contributes to mainstreaming gender in all humanitarian action program. The last question is why flexible and timely fund is very important for us as a women organization. This is because financial resources is very important for fast startup to respond immediately to the critical needs for women in a timely manner. Also, that enable us as a women organizations to link or to combine humanitarian interventions to developmental interventions that accelerate empowerment of women. So in conclusion, if women organizations receive a quick, sustainable, efficient, flexible fund, we will increase our access to the target group and expand our work to achieve the need of our change and expected result. I will stop here because of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal, for sharing your experiences as a women's-led organization focused on women's issues in Gaza. Your experience sounds to me like a lot of the experiences of smaller organizations in our sector, where they receive maybe some project-based funds, but really don't have that quality of funding that we were talking about, that is more about flexibility, longer term, sustainable funding, which I think is so important if you're a small organization to be able to sort of live and breathe year on year. But let's hear from another member of civil society and to see how these experiences might compare. Adesu Kosivi is the regional coordinator of West, Central, and North Africa and West Asia of the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. So Adesu, you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective than Amal, but you're also a civil society group. Tell us about your experiences and how this conversation resonates or does not resonate with you.
Thank you so much, Christiana. I hope you can hear me very well. My name is Kosivi Adesu. I'm working for Global Network for Disaster Reduction. I will start with a very provocative statement, and please accept that. So I just want to say the Ukrainian crisis should not lead to undermining the several and diverse crises the world has been going through. Forced displacement also are at an all-time high that we've never seen before. It's important to, I think it's important to keep that also in mind, and also say that the grand bargain, which was a great hope for the humanitarian actors, could not meet the expectations. In 2020, 4% of the international fund went to local organizations. Unfortunately, in 2021, proportion of the direct funding went 2% only of the proportion of direct funding went to local actors, which is like decreasing, showing a kind of decreasing of the momentum around the grand bargain. The issue of humanitarian has been extremely reinforced, not only because of conflicts, but also because of climate change and disaster that are becoming more and more regular. Emergency events data, the last year has registered or recorded 432 disasters around the world, with a very heavy number of deaths and affected people. We all agree that the humanitarian question goes beyond the media phase, because we all agree that when there is a crisis, when there is a need, then media are there for the beginning, and sometimes the momentum change, the interest change, and they leave the floor. But the humanitarian need are still there, even at that time. In general, we have been focusing our activity on both development and humanitarian aspect, and generally, the process to reach to provide any kind of humanitarian support has never been successfully ended, simply because we try to understand the challenge the community faces, first of all. Then we map some local actions with the communities, because we need to integrate their need in the process, their expectation in the process. And sometimes the time you finish that process, when you reach the level of the time of implementation, that the resources are gone, and you don't have money to really implement the activity. So generally, two challenges arose in that case. Either we never have sufficient resources to implement action that can leverage the resilience of communities, because these activities are left to the national government, which are generally poor, especially in the developing countries. Or the challenge evolve, and the priority shifts from the very quickly. So sometimes some humanitarian situations are very quickly forgotten or left behind, simply because new arose, not because they are addressed, but simply because a new problem arose. And this is one of the reasons why we think the number of humanitarian cases are increasing. So, and as you can see, most of the process ended up, unfortunately, when we have a good understanding of the problem and when the root causes are really identified. It's important to remind that apart from the man-made disaster, climate-induced risks are highly increasing, and the cost of development and humanitarian are also doing so. To be able, in my view, to handle humanitarian needs, donors should provide more resources to empower local organizations, because local organizations are cheaper than the international system. It's also important to make sure that the resources reach the most in need and on time, because sometimes the money arrives but very late. And we start scaling, the type of humanitarian need. It's also important to support early warning, early action programs to try to avoid what is still avoidable rather than waiting for the situation to occur to respond. And also to support preventive and DRR actions. I think the humanitarian actors should expand a bit their view to DRR and early warning action. And finally, I want to insist on the need to promote the collaboration between the development actors and the humanitarian for integrated activities. This can help to avoid duplication of resources, as Amal said earlier. And finally, make sure that resources are available for long-term activities so that we can anticipate, we can respond on time. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Kosivi, for that. It sounds to me like, yeah, a lot of what you and Amal share some reservations about how you are funded because you either don't have enough funds or you don't have the right kind of funds at the right time to be able to do what you need to do. And that local organizations, you've mentioned they're cheaper, they potentially have more impact on the ground, and yet suffer from this lack of real sustainability in terms of funding. So thanks for that. I now want to turn to our final speaker on this panel, who represents both a recipient of assistance and a donor to your partners. Farida Bena, Director of Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. Very good to see you, Farida. Thanks very much for contributing to the discussion here. So, as I said, you're both a recipient and a donor of assistance. And you've been at the forefront of improving both the quality of aid and the localization of aid through your work at IRC. So, based on what you've heard from the global level and now from 2 civil society organizations, what is your assessment of current efforts to localize aid? What further changes are important? And what has been the impact through your eyes on the slow pace of change that we just heard about?
Thank you very much, Christina, for having me. These are tough questions. I'll do my best to answer them based also on the plenty of data that the previous speakers have shared with us. International Rescue Committee is proactively engaged on not so much the issue of the quantity of humanitarian funding flowing. We've seen some sobering statistics. The gap between resources and needs is getting bigger and bigger. But we're looking at this funding in relative terms. We're looking at the quality. So what we do see, based on our analysis of the data provided by both development initiatives, OCHA, but also our local actors on the panel, is that the funding somehow keeps growing. It may be inadequate to the needs, but it is growing. What doesn't happen yet is that this increase somehow gets lost along the way to the front lines where it is most needed. So we've seen a very grim statistic that the funding to local actors has actually at its lowest. It's only 1.3%, the lowest in 5 years. Why is that? That's the kind of question that we're asking ourselves and the biggest players. And we think there are 2 sides to this medal. The first is direct funding going from donor governments to civil society and implementing partners. That definitely needs to increase, as has been said very eloquently by my predecessor. But there's also another side to this issue, which is indirect funding, funding that flows through the transaction chain. We analyzed the data back to pre-COVID years, and we found out that around, I would say even more than half of all humanitarian assistance going around the world goes through the multilateral system, primarily UN agencies. So half of the picture needs to take into account the unique role of UN agencies in receiving and providing aid. Similarly, half of all the so-called quality funding, meaning the good, predictable, flexible, timely funding that Amal was talking about, also flows through multilateral agencies. What happens is that the quality of the funding gets lost by the time it reaches the front lines, which is the reason why people and associations like the one led by Amal end up getting short-term funding, funded that is only secured project by project and fails to sustain the hard work that implementing actors, international, national, local, civil society, have to carry out to respond to sudden and protracted crises. And that doesn't really make sense, because when you think that 86% of all humanitarian crises today are protracted, as Angus told us, that's inadequate. We are not matching the right resources with this kind of crisis. And increasingly, we will see crisis lasting longer and longer. We all hope that the Ukraine crisis will be resolved soon. But even if we just calculate the time for Ukrainian refugees to go back home, it'll take more than a few weeks. So let's just be realistic. We are looking at another long-term crisis. And the Ukraine crisis, let me be a little bit provocative here. Anya perhaps can correct me, but according to our analysis, 75% of the Ukraine appeal has already been covered. That's in stark contrast with the 20% coverage of all the other appeals on average. So clearly there are double standards here in terms of which humanitarian crises take priority, especially in the news. So as IRC, we do receive funding and we provide it. And for us to try and solve all the complicated multiple facets of this big issue, the funding that doesn't trickle down to the front lines, is something that we have tried to do for several years through the grand bargain for aid efficiency and effectiveness. And quite frankly, we have made very slow progress because these are complex issues. So perhaps what we need is a different approach, a much more strategic approach. And what we are trying as IRC is to really address big things first. First things first. Let's look at the biggest donors. Let's look at the largest UN agencies. Let's look at the biggest international NGOs, the biggest local NGO network. Let's bring them together to the table and see if together these big players can create that critical mass needed to ensure that we somehow shake the system and we start cascading that funding down the transaction chain. And hopefully, if we get a good result, maybe by focusing on a specific region or on a specific sector, other donors, other agencies will follow suit and help us really create and push for aid reform. So that's the reason why IRC has convened the strategic dialogue or caucus on quality funding within the grand bargain. And we have gathered only a select number of organizations, not that because we want to be exclusive, but really because we want to tackle the biggest challenges first. This caucus will end in July, hopefully with an agreement to channel more multi-year flexible funding and hopefully also more timely funding in exchange, and that's the part of the bargain that we provide as implementing partners, in exchange for higher transparency, accountability, but also evidence that this multi-year funding really works. IRC a couple of years ago published a report called A Win-Win. A multi-year funding is better value for donors and better for people. And we found out that multi-year funding does produce tangible results in terms of higher women's empowerment, gender equality, lasting results, lighter administrative burden. What Amal was telling us about having to write 25 different projects and only see 7 of them approved. All of that, or at least a good chunk of that, could be avoided if we finally matched the right kind of funding with the recurring, increasingly frequent, protracted nature of humanitarian crisis today. So that's what we are doing. We're very conscious that as a provider and a recipient, so having this dual role, we also need to lead by example. So what we did last year was to publish another report called very aptly Focus on the Front Lines. And I'll drop the link in the chat, in which we make a number of commitments ourselves, or we renew our existing commitments. For example, we committed to increase the resources that we provide to our own local partners by half in one fiscal year. We commit to continuing to build the strategic partnerships with local associations, half of which will be led by women. And we recommitted to channel 25% of our humanitarian funding to local and national responders by 2024 or earlier. But we also commit, for example, to start reporting the pass-through, how much funding we cascade down the transaction chain by 2024. And that's a major deal for organizations like IRC, because it requires setting up a central administrative and financial system that produces aggregate data. Right now, what we have is data by country programs, sometimes by programs, not even country programs. So it does take a huge investment in resources to be able to adapt and update our infrastructure and be more transparent. But we want to do this. We very much hope that the caucus will produce a different kind of bargain or a result by mid-July. So I'll be happy to report perhaps at a future event. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that, Farida, and for your insights on some of the trends that we've been listening to on localization, on protracted crises, and what you're seeing as someone who sits on both sides of humanitarian financing. I note that your antidote to all of this is big things first, which I think is really important. If we get the big players to move, to be the first movers, we can create that tipping point that is so important for systems change. Because right now, what I see is so many disparate activities going on across the sector. Everybody knows what to do, but we haven't had that critical mass. So thanks for offering that as a potential solution. And thanks also for talking about the work that you're doing through the Grand Bargain Caucus. I think we all look forward to hearing more about that next week at the annual meeting and in the months to come. Now what I'd like to do is turn back to our poll. We had a poll, we asked you to respond to a poll a few minutes ago. And I think, 80 some odd people responded to that poll. So let's bring up the results of that poll and have a look at them and see if that resonates with any of you on our panel. So panelists, have a look and see if any of this makes sense to you, or if you have any insights to contribute. Okay, the question was, what is the most important way in which humanitarian financing needs to change and adapt? We don't have a clear winner here, actually. I think the most votes coming in at 29% is more coherent humanitarian development peace building financing. So the elusive nexus financing, followed by more funding to local actors and increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of funding, with then the other answers a little bit further behind. So yeah, that's, I guess, not a surprising result, given that we've emphasized all of these issues in the panel today. But let's maybe take one or two of those and have a discussion about them. And maybe I'll go to Angus first, actually, on this. Angus, while you were speaking, we had a question by someone in the audience about the balance of humanitarian and development funding. And as we shout about more funding for humanitarian action, is this a zero-sum game? Are we taking money away from development actors and therefore not addressing some of those foundational elements of why people suffer and end up being vulnerable? Did the DI report look at that balance at all? And given the fact that that's a priority, that kind of nexus, that balance in that nexus, is a priority for the people on in this event today.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And I think so we did touch upon it, and I think I mentioned that a greater proportion of the development assistance, or the total development assistance bundle, is going towards humanitarian assistance. It's still a relatively small proportion of the bigger overseas official development assistance pie. And also we saw, as we also showed, that multilateral development banks, who are obviously big providers of ODA, are also increasing the share of their resources that go into these countries. And I think you can look at this in two ways to some extent. I think that kind of increased engagement is obviously really important. I think in this current context, where there are very distinct strains on wider development budgets, I think it would be very short term, and I think it would be very narrowly focused if we just said, let's just get more humanitarian assistance in there, and let's pull that away from wider development budgets. Because I think what we saw, and as you mentioned, this kind of that fairly stark statistic about the volume of humanitarian assistance that's going to protracted crisis countries, 86% of it. These crises aren't resolving themselves. Humanitarian assistance isn't, and indeed humanitarian assistance isn't and probably can't be the answer to that. And I think even if you look at the way in which humanitarian assistance itself is allocated, most of the assistance is going to those short-term immediate life-saving needs necessarily. The volume of finance that goes, for instance, to the early recovery sector is absolutely minuscule. It's by far the smallest sector, by far the worst funded sector as well. So I think we certainly can't be taking away that wider development assistance away from just to pay for the humanitarian response. And I think the other part of this picture is also it's not just about the volume of development assistance that's reaching these countries in crisis, but it's also about how that development assistance itself is structured. So the extent to which development assistance can actually engage in and deliver for crisis affected countries. So both whether that's through the way in which assistance is structured in terms of grants and loans, the risk of debt distress, but also the way in which critical areas of development assistance are delivered, where they're based upon an assumption of having a degree of existing infrastructure, which we know in many crisis-affected countries isn't the case. And also the way in which much development assistance is structured to go through national governments on the assumption of systems that will deliver for crisis-affected regions. And we know, therefore, that not necessarily all of that development assistance will be getting there. So I think the answer to the question is also about this kind of restructuring about how development assistance reaches crisis-affected countries. So I think, critically important that we don't just take money from development assistance to fund humanitarian assistance, but also that we think more widely about how development assistance actually reaches those crisis-affected populations.
And what about the climate element of this? I noted in your presentation that climate finance hasn't really stepped up. What can we do about that?
Sorry, Christine, I didn't hear the first part of your question.
The climate, there was a statistic in your presentation about climate finance, or financing for climate adaptation, not really rising to the challenge of, loss and damage, for example, or, rising to the challenge of needing to invest more in some of the humanitarian sides, I guess, of this conversation. Is there scope for that?
Well, I think from what little we know, just starting to look at that intersection, is I think around loss and damage, definitely, this is an emerging conversation at the moment. It's very nascent. We've got very few governments committed to this loss and damage pool, and that's really where, for crisis-affected countries, it's about kind of, I guess, paying for the impact of crisis response. So there's definitely scope for that, but it's very, very much a kind of emergent discussion. I think the other comments I made around the structuring of development assistance also apply to the structuring of climate finance assistance as well. It's about the receptiveness and the ability of that finance to actually be delivered to crisis-affected context, but also the way in which that finance is conceptualized. So whether or not we're really kind of assessing the level of risk in the right way, because we know that as soon as a natural disaster strikes in a very fragile, vulnerable context, then the knock-on effect, the cyclical effect of impact on conflict, and indeed then further on environmental degradation that might drive further crisis, is perhaps more significant than it is in other countries where the level of natural disaster risk or environmental risk might be in absolute terms higher, but the knock-on effect in those vulnerable crisis contexts is more significant. So it's again a question around how we conceptualize and think about targeting of that climate finance.
Great, thanks for that, Angus, and putting that into perspective. I've got another question from the audience here, and I'm going to look at Amal and Farida to answer this as I ask it. And this gets to the poll question on more funds to local organizations. I'm just going to read it out to you now. From my past experience in Central African Republic, the humanitarian country team has agreed to allocate almost 30% of humanitarian funds from the country-based humanitarian fund allocation to local organizations. This was a good move to encourage national organizations to implement projects on the ground. Why can this good practice not be replicated in other areas with humanitarian crises? And I guess I'm interpreting that as, what are some of the blockers that we're still encountering, given the fact that there is good practice out there? Farida, do you want to start?
Wow.
Smiling, so I guess, are you ready?
$1 million question. I think Anya is probably better placed to answer this question, given that IRC doesn't manage country-based pool funds. From my perspective, I think every region, every country may have different challenges and also different donors. And what we have learned in our work on quality funding is that when there is a sudden emergency, some donors simply don't have the internal infrastructure to be able to disburse funds to a myriad of local organizations. So they channel the funding to multilateral organizations with the expectation that it will be cascaded to local actors. But there's an issue there in terms of what I presented earlier, but also in terms of timeliness. We know, for example, that during COVID, some of our partners ended up waiting 8 months before receiving funding, which had already been allocated and pledged. But by the time it reached the front lines, it took 8 months. And 8 months in COVID terms means a lot of lives lost. So I do take this advice that, and this is what we're pushing for also, if we're not ready for a system-wide reform, let's agree on a specific region. Let's try this in parallel with business as usual. It could be sub-Saharan Africa, it could be even a more specific area, but let's gather the biggest players and adopt the same approach in one specific region and see what happens, to see if we reach that tipping point you were talking about earlier, Christina.
Great, Farida, thank you. And while you've got the floor, and I'm going to come around to the others on this, can I ask you kind of the final takeaway question for everybody as we bring this to a close in a few minutes? What, Farida, is the one key change you would see to the system of humanitarian financing before we convene in a year's time? So if you're sitting here in 1 year, so 12 months from now, what is that one change that you would like to see?
I would say is what we are working on now, which is to start with what we've got. We can always ask for more funding, and that is our request, but also better manage the funding that we do already get and make sure that the quality reaches the front lines through the system, whether we get it through direct funding or indirectly through multilaterals. But let's start with what we've got. Let's bring the biggest players together. And I must say, some donors are very receptive to this. I see some of them on this call. Other donors are taking the attitude of, I already give a lot of funding. Why should I bother? Why should I always start or give the example? And I would say, because you are a key player, because you are such a major donor, you have a responsibility to lead. And until you move, other donors, other agencies will be sitting on the fence waiting for you to take the first step. So there's a leadership component there, and I'm really counting on the biggest players to give the example, even if they have a good track record.
Thanks very much for that, Farida. Amal, if you can hear us, can I turn to you with two questions? The first is around the blockers to local organizations receiving funding. And then the second question is, what is the one thing you would like to see in 1 year's time to improve humanitarian financing?
Yes, first about the quota of the NGOs from the fund. From my opinion, it's very good, but it doesn't mean that the quota of women organization will increase. 30% of fund will go to NGOs. That's not mean 30% of fund will go to women organizations. Lack of fund go to women organization. The second question that I wanted to if I want to change or to see something that is changing in the fund, maybe I want to highlight some things regarding to the flexibility, and I want to see more flexibility in the fund to receive core fund more than project fund. Also, to donor must respect our changing in our interventions, especially after the emergency. For example, after the last offensive on Gaza, there are many donors refuse to respect our changing in the interventions regarding to the priority. So more flexibility in the fund is very important for us as a women organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. And I think you would also hear that from Kosivi if you were still on the line. He mentioned flexibility and the ability to change course as needs arise as something he was very concerned about when he spoke. So thanks for that. Angus, I'm going to turn now to you for your final word on what is the key change you would like to see in 1 year?
So I think it's a difficult question, isn't it, in terms of aspiration, but also what's realistic. But I think, we've heard a lot from both Kosivi and Amal about kind of the struggles of being a local organisation and how funding reaches those. But I think it really is possible and realistic that local organisations receive a significantly greater proportion of flexible multi-year funding. But equally, I think that we see a change in the way in which that funding is also passed down. Farida mentioned, the way in which the transaction chain seems to suck out the funding and the quality of the funding before it reaches those organisations. And I think it's really, really realistically possible that we address the issue around the pass-through of overheads, for instance. And I think that's an issue that really is a nut ready to crack. It requires some quite hard choices, but I don't see why in 12 months' time we can't have seen a significant step change in the way in which local organisations are properly respected, and we recognise the true cost of implementing projects for all of the project partners, particularly those who are actually on the front line implementing those projects.
Wonderful. Thanks, Angus. Thanks, Amal. Thanks, Farida. And thanks to the rest of the panelists for this discussion. We're at time, and I won't go into detailed summary, but just to maybe say we've actually painted quite a disappointing picture around some of these global trends. Certainly from someone who, uses these funds and is also a donor, I'm a little disheartened by what I'm hearing. I'd like to feel a little bit more optimistic. But I am more optimistic because what I've heard also from this group are some really, some things that we can do. Some really clear asks around flexibility, and that's flexibility in terms of how you spend the money, flexibility in terms of changing course, quality about how the money transacts as it goes down the humanitarian transaction chain and actually reaches the ground. We need to do better at more money reaching the ground, and perhaps revisit some of these overheads, as you say, Angus. And at Start Network, we're going to be doing a big campaign on ICR shortly. So I'm with you on that. And then really around sustainability, whether it's sustainability for protracted crises, 86%, that's a big number of humanitarian crises being 5 years or more. How do we sustain that level of funding, that level of interest, and what's the mix of funding that we need to employ for that? But also the sustainability of our enterprise as a mix of organizations, many of whom are small, but do really, really good work. How do we sustain our funding for them who cannot live, from project to project, because then what do they do in between? So I think we've got some clear asks of the system for the next 12 months. I think we have some clear asks for all of you who are participating in the G7 discussions in the next week, and in the grand bargain discussions that will also be coming in the next week. So there's some really clear policy opportunities to be promoting some of these messages that you've heard today. Please go forth and do that, because what we do is so important, and the generosity of your time and your money and all of the collective work that we do together is important to people, and we should always remember that. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for joining. and enjoy the rest of ECOSOC.